Technology. This is the iPhone 14 Pro Max. This is my review. There's nothing inherently wrong with the 14 Pro or the 14 Pro Max. They're the latest versions of Apple's highest end phones. They have great specs, they have great design, they have great cameras, great battery life. All those things could have been said about the iPhone 13 Pro series last year, so you're getting a lot of similarities here. Because of that, I totally get it if you can't bring yourself to buying one of these things. The big new feature is the Dynamic Island. It's a software experience baked into the notch at the top of the screen, and it's really the only way you can tell the 14 Pro or Pro Max from the 13 Pro series. And to be honest, it's kind of like the cheapest way that Apple could have differentiated the design from the 13 Pro without totally revamping the phone as a whole. And it's a weird year for the iPhone. Apple's kind of repackaging the 13 Pro with a few extra features, and they're all nice features. They're very nice to have. But there's no question that this is a very iterative year for the iPhone. There's nothing earth-shattering about this phone. You kind of have to care about having a higher resolution camera, a faster refresh rate screen, or a notch that gives you some extra features. Now, undoubtedly, if you buy this phone, you will love it. It's a great phone, but it's not going to feel new unless you're coming from something like an iPhone 11 or earlier. Here's why. Okay, so the Dynamic Island. It is a branded notch, which is something only Apple would ever really do. It uses a bunch of custom software to hide the fact that it's actually an eye-shaped notch. It's actually using some custom pixel restructuring to make the sides as round as possible, and each animation has been crafted meticulously for probably a good amount of time. They're extremely fast, fluid, and they feel like the notch is coming alive. It's kind of cool to look at. Now, actually using the Dynamic Island, as bad as that name is, it's kind of fun. Touching and holding will spring to life some quick controls for the app that you're using in the background, like music. A tap will bring you back to the app that the Dynamic Island is using. And if you were to open up two apps with background tasks running that both use the Dynamic Island, it'll split into two different parts and show you each live activity as it's happening. Now, the island is also the new home for things like Face ID, so you'll see that pop up whenever you use Face ID on your iPhone. And it's also the home of live activities, which is finally here in iOS 16.1. It's all very fun to play with without question, but its usefulness is definitely up in the air. The number one way that I've used the Dynamic Island is to control my music, and I could already do that through Control Center with a swipe down. The island doesn't improve or hinder the experience, it's just kind of there. It's a little bit redundant when you consider what the Control Center already brought to the table. Now, other apps like the voice recorder and the timer will be far more useful because you can see what's happening in each app. You can see on a little clock how much time you have left on a timer. You can watch the voice memo waveform sort of light up and record your voice. It's kind of cool to look at. Phone calls are also very neat. They're actually really handy. If you were to take a phone call and you go back to the Dynamic Island, you will see your voice light up on a waveform in one color and the person you're talking to's voice light up in a different color. It's not that big a deal, but it's a nice touch. Now, obviously, because you're touching the top of your screen, that's also where the selfie camera is. So you're probably wondering if it gets filled up with smudges all the time. It does. I don't know why people lie on video and say that it doesn't. It definitely does, because whenever I touch it, I'm touching the selfie camera. So I'm sort of constantly cleaning it like this on my shirt. It's a bit of a pain, but the price of admission for the Dynamic Island on your iPhone 14 Pro. The only thing missing from the island is notifications. That's still a separate overlay on your screen, and I'm not sure why it is. Apple should just integrate that directly into the island and make the notch blow up whenever you get a text message or something. It would just look so much better. So, is it a gimmick? Not really. It's semi-useful in some circumstances if you just want to access music controls or see the ETA for an Uber ride or whatever using live activities. It works well enough that it's not really a gimmick. It's just on the borderline of becoming one, which is a separate thing from being a useful feature. It's not revolutionary. This isn't a reason to buy this phone, but it's nice to have, sure, and it looks a lot prettier than the old notch, I'll tell you that. But it's definitely not going to change your entire world. Now, the dynamic island sits on top of two screens that are almost identical to the 13 Pro and Pro Max. At least on the 14 Pro Max, like I have here, you're getting a 6.7-inch Super Retina XDR display. It's OLED, it looks beautiful. It almost looks like a sticker on top of the phone. It looks wonderful. I don't know what else to say about it. You've heard me brag about these phone screens for a while. Top of the line. There is one new feature on these displays this year, and it's the increase in brightness. So before, the 13 Pro and Pro Max could go up to about 1200 nits. The 14 Pro and Pro Max go up to 2000 nits. Now, you're probably never actually going to get to 2000 nits because you probably have to be in direct sunlight playing HDR content, which, how often are you doing that really? But the extra headroom that you get with the 2000 nits makes a difference day to day. The extra brightness is just great. If you're just walking on the boardwalk or something in the direct sunlight, you can see the screen exceptionally easy through sunglasses. It's as if you're not wearing sunglasses at all and you're just looking at the phone screen in a dark room. Of course, the extra brightness isn't what's getting all the attention, it's the always on display. It's a bit of a controversial feature because a lot of people don't like it and other people say it's the best thing to ever come to the iPhone. I'm definitely in the camp of those who don't like it. So the way it works is with one toggle, Apple lets you turn it on or turn it off in display settings, and it shows you your clock, your notifications, and your wallpaper just dimmed a lot. And this is a lot busier than other always on displays. I'm a huge fan of the pixels because of how simple it is. Apple sort of overcomplicates it because they show you all this information where you kind of only want a clock to glance at while your phone's sitting on your desk. I don't really need to see my wallpaper through it. As nice as it looks, I don't need that. And it kind of trips you up into thinking that your phone is on. And it's not. It's sleeping, but the always on display is on. It's very weird. Plus, I've noticed it drains my battery much more than I thought. I'm looking at like 5 to 10% difference every day, which is way too much for a feature that I don't even really like. So I turned it off. You can feel free to keep it on if you're okay with sacrificing that battery life. Hopefully Apple gives us a way to customize it in the future, but until then, I'm going to keep mine off. So, the cameras. The iPhone 14 Pro and Pro Max get the biggest jump in camera technology that the iPhone has gotten since the 6S came out in 2015. It's finally switching from 12 megapixels to 48 megapixels for its main lens. That's a 4x jump in terms of megapixels that you have to play with, so there's a lot to unpack here. Apple made not one, but two bold shifts with the camera setup on the 14 Pro. It boosted the resolution of the main lens, and it completely re-engineered its entire photo processing pipeline. It's now called the Photonic Engine, which, I don't know, is that supposed to invoke feelings that like Apple is a professional photographer or something? I don't know what that branding even is. Photonic isn't a word. With each sensor, just like last year, Apple's doing a similar level of processing. It's taking a bunch of shots, lining them all up, and sort of picking the best bits from each one. Now, paired with that is that new 48 megapixel lens, which uses pixel binning to produce 12 megapixel images. So, did Apple do it? Did they make the best camera system on a phone with the 14 Pro and Pro Max? No. Each photo that I capture on this phone is exceptional. I'm not gonna lie. I mean, they're great pictures. They have excellent detail, excellent sharpness, good clarity, good color, good contrast. At night, it's the same experience, but the overall quality isn't necessarily better than the 13 Pro. It's just different. Now, this boils down to how the photonic engine processes each picture. So I've just noticed that compared to the 13 Pro, the 14 Pro has a tendency to blow out highlights. Like, it's just not afraid to do that. I don't know if it's in the name of keeping them more natural or whatever that is, but Apple's just doing different things this year. It's boosting contrast when it probably shouldn't, and there's a level of sharpness in nighttime photos that seems pretty unnatural. And compared to phones like the Pixel 7 Pro, it's kind of dealer's choice. It's whatever you want to go with. I can't definitively tell you whether either of them is better. It's the same thing with the S22 Ultra from Samsung earlier this year. They're just different cameras. I will say it's kind of a shame that I can't just flat out tell you whether there's a best overall smartphone camera, because each smartphone camera has its own strengths and weaknesses. For another year, it's kind of up to you to decide what you want to see in your pictures. Now, while the iPhone doesn't necessarily take a jump in quality compared to the 13 Pro, it's definitely taking a jump in the amount of things that you can do. You can take 48 megapixel photos with this camera. You just have to flick on Pro RAW. I do that almost every time I want to edit a picture in Lightroom. You just get that extra detail that's so much fun to mess with in Lightroom. It's really great. Now, with the 48 megapixel camera, you can crop in at 2x using a new 2x button in the camera app, and that uses the middle 12 megapixels of the sensor so that you can get 2x lossless zoom. Now that's really handy because the 3x is always kind of too close almost, so having that 2x middle ground is really nice. It's especially nice in portrait mode, which is also getting an upgrade this year with new 2x and 1x zoom levels. In addition, the 12 megapixel ultra wide and telephoto cameras can capture a bit more light and detail thanks to improved sensors and the photonic engine. It's not a huge leap over the 13 Pro, but it gets the job done. If there's one area where you can definitively say the iPhone is the best, it's video quality. It's almost untouchable at this point. And there's no 8K video support, which I guess is kind of weird since this is a 48 megapixel camera and it can support 8K video. But there's no way to really look at 8K video anyway. At least no consumer solution like a monitor from Samsung or a TV from LG. There's just no way to do it right now. So 4K it is. Now speaking of 4K, you can also shoot cinematic mode video in 4K, which looks a lot better than the 13 Pro cinematic mode because of that, but it's still not perfect since it can't really focus on the right subject 100% of the time, but it gets the job done if you want to have a cool effect every now and then. There's also a new action mode in the camera, and it does exactly what you would think. It lets you run around with your camera and not have to deal with any shakiness. It works fine, but you can't use it at night because it needs a ton of light to work, and it crops in so much into the frame that it's almost not worth it. If you're capturing a 4K movie, you can't use action mode because it's going to shoot at 2.8K. That's how far it crops in. That's a lot. You're much better off getting a tripod or some sort of a gimbal to stabilize your iPhone instead of running around with action mode on. So yeah, the 14 Pro and Pro Max have great camera systems, but so do the 13 Pro, and so does a lot of Android phones nowadays. They shake things up with a few new features, but at the end of the day, they're really similar. Maybe next year Apple will just redo everything and just start from scratch with an all-new system. I doubt it, but they could, and at that point, maybe it'll be worth an upgrade just for the camera. But at least for the 14 Pro series, nah, I would just sit this one out. Apple's taken a pretty aggressive stance recently that its devices could save your life one day, which is just very Apple. On the iPhone 14 series, Apple's including 2 new safety features that plug right into that idea. You've got emergency SOS via satellite, and you have car crash detection. Now, emergency SOS can literally tap into a satellite and give you a cell connection if you're in a pinch and you need emergency cellular connection. There's a lot of behind the scenes work here. Each text message that gets sent goes to a communication center that's employed and operated by Apple, and then it's transferred to the necessary emergency service center based on your location and conditions. Now, actually using the feature seems pretty simple. Your iPhone will point you in the direction of the closest satellite to give you the strongest connection, and then let you make an emergency communication with somebody. Now, there's also crash detection, which can automatically alert emergency services if it thinks you've been in a car crash. If it's triggered, you'll have 20 seconds to disable it. Otherwise, emergency services will be contacted on your behalf. I haven't tested either of these new features, but I'm gonna just assume that they work. I'll drop some links in the description below of some other reporters that have done some testing, but as far as I'm concerned, these are just really good for peace of mind. Just God forbid, in case you were in a situation where you need either of these, they're just nice to have, which is great. Performance and software. I was gonna go on a whole tangent in this section of my review about both of those things, but just know that they're both good. There's an A16 Bionic processor in here. It's just as fast as the A15 Bionic was on my 13 Pro last year. Now, of course, the 14 series runs iOS 16. There's a handful of really nice features in here. I love the new lock screen customization experience. Having widgets on my lock screen is pretty great. I've got the weather and a to-do list here. I should really finish up that to-do list. And of course, you can choose custom fonts and everything like that. It's a really neat feature. I'm also really liking the ability to edit messages in iMessage, share pictures in the iCloud shared photo library, and typing with haptic feedback flicked on. It's just magical. It just feels so much better. I encourage each and every one of you to enable haptic feedback on your keyboards, on your iPhones in iOS 16. You will not regret it. But of course, it is iOS. And if previous versions of iOS weren't enough to sway you away from Android, this version isn't going to do that either. It's still very Apple, and there's still nothing here that could convince you, I don't think, in my opinion, to switch from Android, unless you just wanted to try something new, I guess. Okay, let's talk about battery life. So for context, I've been using the 14 Pro Max since launch day. And around that time, a lot of people started getting their phones, and they all started complaining how the 14 Pro Max was a lot worse than the 13 Pro Max. And it was the same conversation for the 14 Pro compared to the 13 Pro. I don't have a 13 Pro Max to compare the 14 to, but I will say that early on, with the stock version of iOS 16 that came out of the box, this phone was only lasting a couple of hours more than my 13 Pro did last year, which I was not expecting because the 13 Pro Max made a reputation for having some of the best battery life that you can get. Luckily, it seems that that problem solely stemmed back to software issues. So I've gotten a handful of updates on this phone, and the most recent was iOS 16.0.3. That one was the one that got this battery life back to being a king in the smartphone market. This is some of the best battery life I've ever had on a phone. So I can go from 7 a.m. to, let's say, 12 a.m. Okay, 7 a.m. to midnight, and I'll have 45% battery, 50% battery on this thing. On heavier days, I can probably knock it down to maybe 40%, but I've never gotten it any lower in a full day. Typically, I don't use my phone that much, and it's a lot of background music. You know, I play a lot of background music on my phone, just over my AirPods or something. So day to day, I'm typically ending days with 55 to 60% left in the tank. I do that so frequently that I can confidently say this is some of the best battery life that I've ever had on a phone. Now, I wish I had equally as nice things to say about charging. For some ungodly reason, Apple's still sticking with 27-watt charging on the 14 Pro and Pro Max. This is the dumbest thing I've ever seen in my life. I just reviewed the OnePlus 10T over the summer with 125-watt charging, and that thing could go from 0 to 100 in less than 20 minutes. I'm not sure if this is a limitation of Lightning or whatever the reason is. Maybe Apple's just being stubborn with it. Whatever the situation, I really hope Apple just figures out what to do here, because it would be a lot better if this phone would just charge it. Just give me 45 watts like the latest Galaxies have. That's all I need. In case you're wondering, you can still charge at 15 watts wirelessly using MagSafe, and there's still no way to reverse wireless charge on the 14 Pro or Pro Max, or any iPhone for that matter. I really wish I could take my AirPods and just plop them to the back of my iPhone and watch them charge. I don't know why they don't do that. It's kind of stupid. The battery's definitely big enough. Now, you didn't think I was going to not talk about Esim, did you? It wouldn't be an iPhone 14 series review without talking about Esim. For the very first time in the iPhone's existence, Apple is using electronic SIM cards exclusively in place of physical SIM cards. This is only taking place in the United States, but I have a feeling that change is going to affect other markets very soon. So, is it any worse or is it better than using a physical SIM card? Kind of complicated. Now, when you're setting up your iPhone 14 or 14 Pro, you'll be asked to convert your physical SIM card to an eSIM. Apple integrates every major carrier into this easy to follow setup process. I have T-Mobile, so it was really easy for me to set up my iPhone and convert to an eSIM. I just logged right into my account, gave me a couple buttons to push. Within 2 minutes, I would say, I had the SIM card downloaded to my iPhone and it was already activated, which was great. The only time I ever had a problem with activating an eSIM was when there was one day I had flipped the eSIM between my iPhone and a Pixel 7 Pro, I think 4 times, just to see if I could break it. And I managed to break it. I had to get T-Mobile involved and they helped solve the whole thing, but it was a little bit strange because if I just took out a physical SIM card, I could just put it in the new device and I know it'll work 100% of the time. I haven't had any major eSIM activation issues. I don't think normal people will be flipping an eSIM between 2 phones 4 times a day, so that shouldn't be a problem either. But I know there are plenty of people that don't like eSIM because of just random carrier issues. And this feels kind of icky. It feels like another way Apple's trying to lock you into using its phones. It's definitely not, because you can move it pretty easily, but it's not as easy as moving an eSIM between an iPhone and an iPhone. Apple actually gives you an easy way to do that. That's just not the case between iPhone and Android. And in terms of whether it works any better, it's a SIM card, so it works the same exact way. A few final notes here. The speaker quality on the 14 Pro Max is excellent. These remain my favorite speakers on a phone. Now, call quality was also really great. I didn't have any connectivity issues, and everyone that I spoke to said that I sounded clear on their end. And finally, I would just like to mention some of the cases that I've been using, because I know how important the case situation is for a lot of users. Let's see what I've got. So during my review process, I pretty much had a case on my phone every single day. I never did use it naked because it just feels like I'm gonna drop it. It feels too expensive. So I had a lot of cases sent in to me. So these were some of my favorites. So Totally had sent me a few of their really thin cases. They're just great, really low profile cases if you just want something to throw on your iPhone so you get a little bit more grip. Nomad was awesome because they sent over a bunch of their cases. Here's 2 of my favorites. You got their new rugged case, which isn't too thick. It's thick, but it's not too thick. And it adds a ton of protection. Plus this green color is really sick. And of course, my all-time favorite marine blue sport case, which is also wonderful, it's a little bit thinner and it still adds a good amount of protection. And of course, my buddies over at Spigen sent a whole box full of cases. This is the Mag Armor case, which is a perfect go-to case if you just want something to throw on your phone with protection and with MagSafe. And here's their clear case. I love their clear cases because they don't yellow too much. And this one has MagSafe built into it. So I'll have links to all these in the description below if you want to go pick some up. Full disclosure, I'm sure there'll be affiliate links, so just know that I'll probably get a commission every time you buy something through those links. So, should you buy a 14 Pro Max? If you're coming from Android and you want to buy an iPhone and you want just the biggest, best iPhone, you will not regret buying this phone. If you're coming from another iPhone, here's what I would say. If you have an iPhone 12 and you couldn't justify a 13, don't buy a 14 because it's way too similar. If you have an iPhone 13, just keep that phone. There's no reason to upgrade to this one. It does 90% of what this phone does. If you're coming from an iPhone 11 or earlier, yeah, this is probably a good time to upgrade. This phone has a lot of new features that you're going to enjoy. You get a fast refresh rate screen, you have the dynamic island, 48 megapixel camera, slightly faster charging, better battery life, and a way nicer design. Now, that's a lot of upgrades for iPhone 11 users, and that's kind of the pattern that Apple's been following. Each year, it gradually improves each iPhone that comes out. And then once it's time for you to upgrade 2 or 3 years down the line, you get a bunch of new features, and it's great. Now, the 14 Pro and Pro Max introduce a lot of new stuff, so like the dynamic island is not perfect by any means, and the 48 megapixel camera, while it's great, it probably could be better. You know, I'm sure Apple's going to be tweaking that photonic engine a bunch. So Apple's going to be going through some growing pains in the meantime. If you need a new iPhone, this is a great one to buy. It's expensive, yes, but I still think it's a great pickup. Okay, so now I have to put away all my cases, and I got to finish this review. So, hope you enjoyed.